Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Ito, and I'm a broadcast journalist in Toronto, formerly with CBC Radio. I am delighted to join you again for day two of this forum. Over the last 2 days, we have heard about incidents of racism. We have explored ideas of identity and self, and we've talked through recommendations for action and change. Today, I'd like to address all these themes through the lens of leadership. Santa Ono is President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of British Columbia. Santa holds a PhD in experimental medicine from McGill University, and he has taught at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and University College London. He is a Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Canadian, and he joins us. Thanks for having our chat, Santa.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your childhood. You were born in Vancouver, but you were raised in the US in Philadelphia and Baltimore. Just tell me a little bit about where you grew up, your neighborhood.
Well, in Vancouver, I actually grew up on the UBC campus, and I learned to ride my bike on Main Mall. But as you point out, my father moved from UBC to become a professor of mathematics at Penn and at Johns Hopkins. In both situations, we settled in primarily Caucasian neighborhoods. And in Vancouver, as well as in Philadelphia and Baltimore, in the 60s, in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, these were periods of time where there still was a good bit of overt racism within Vancouver, Philadelphia, and in Baltimore. So I would say that growing up as a child, in elementary school, most kids are pretty nice to each other, but as you get older and go to middle school or to high school, I would say that I and my family experienced pretty overt racism at moments. I wouldn't say that our childhood was terrible or anything like that, but for example, my younger brother was dragged into the woods, and the carcass of a dead bird was stuffed behind his shirt, and that's quite a traumatic experience. He was pulled into the woods by a number of Caucasian neighbors. My mother was washing the dishes after dinner, and there's a window above the kitchen sink where she was washing the dishes, and there was a loud bang. And when we looked up, the glass had broken. The police were called, and what had happened was a neighbor had actually shot at our house with a BB gun, and shattered the glass above the sink where my mother was washing her dishes. So we had a number of situations like that. It wasn't unique to us. I think that any minority family or youth will have experienced these sorts of things and heard racial slurs as a child. So that's a little bit about what it was like. But generally speaking, I'd say most of the neighbors were really supportive and friendly. But it was a very different time growing up as one of very few people who were Asian at the time in the schools that we attended.
And when you were growing up, wasn't that also the time of an economic slump in the car industry? And, there was a lot of blame put on the Asian car industry because of that.
Absolutely, and as you know, a number of Asian individuals on both sides of the border um, experienced verbal and even physical assaults based upon their being Asian in that period of time. Absolutely.
hmm what effect do you think that these incidents, both the ones that you would have experienced personally as a child, but also on your family, what effect do you think that had on you?
Well, I was at first horrified. Nobody wants to be singled out as a youngster. I remember we were driving through Manhattan. My brother was studying at the Juilliard School of Music, and we were stopped at an intersection. And someone looked into our car and saw that we were Asian and slammed the hood, the front of the hood. We were inside. I was a young child, and yelled anti-Asian racial epithets at us. It was horrifying. But I remember my father got very angry and opened the door and said, we belong here just as much as you do. And how dare you do this in front of my family? I was actually inspired by that. So it had many different effects of being the target of racial slurs. Certainly, there were periods of time where I wished I wasn't Asian, wished that I looked like anybody else, and so wished that I could just fit in like any other child. Well, there were those moments, but I would say that those episodes in my life also increased my resolve to do something about it and to not accept it. And one of the things that really gratifies me about the current generation of students is that they have become more activist and they've become more vocal in saying this: we have to do something about racism in society.
It is interesting that you say there was a point where you wished you weren't Asian. When I interviewed Pam Sugiman, the Dean of Arts at Ryerson, she said the same thing. She said that at one point she wished she was white and just like everybody else around her. And I think that might have been a common sentiment among many Japanese Canadians at that time. And yet, like you, she seemed to, kind of corral all that experience and the negativity of what she experienced, and it led to motivating her in her academic career. How has all that, your own experience, how has that played a role on shaping who you are as a leader?
Well, I think it's been very formative. I think that it's not just about being a leader and trying to do something about anti-Asian racism. It's really formed me as a leader with respect to other groups. And so I think that, understanding what it feels like not to be embraced by your community, by your sector, for example, the educational post-secondary sector, has really sensitized me to how it must feel to be Indigenous in Canada, how it must feel to be Black, or how it must feel to be Jewish and to experience regular and increasing anti-Semitism. So I think that the impact on me has been to be more empathetic to all people who might feel marginalized and not accepted by society.
There's been a fair amount of attention, though, specific to anti Asian racism in Vancouver. Bloomberg News had called Vancouver the anti Asian hate crime capital of North America. I'm not sure if that title is warranted, but certainly a significant number of racist incidents have happened in the city. What's been the situation at UBC?
Well, UBC has a very large Asian student population, both Asian Canadian and international students. I would say that certainly in speaking with many Asian students at UBC over the past 20 months during the pandemic, as I have had listening sessions with many different groups on campus, it's really clear that at the peak of the anti-Asian violence that does occur here in Vancouver and all around the world, many of our Asian students and faculty and staff were afraid to even leave their apartments or their dorm rooms. We had a student who was accosted outside H Mart on our university campus. So certainly it's something that is very much in the consciousness of members of our academic community, but Asians throughout the city as well.
And so, how are you addressing this racism at UBC? What kind of actions have you been taking?
Well, as I pointed out, I did have a number of listening sessions with various groups, including Asian groups, both faculty, staff, and students. And that's really the first step, is to really try to assess the magnitude of the problem, and it is a very significant issue. Uh, you know, I would say the other way we've been trying to address this is really by trying to identify steps that we can take within the university, but also as a leader, as a major research university in Canada, to try to address the situation across Canada and even internationally. And so we have put together an inclusion action plan, and I put together a task force of faculty members, staff, and students across the institution to develop a set of recommendations. This working group is almost finished with its work, and in the next several weeks, we'll be releasing a set of actions that we believe we can take at UBC to make this a more inclusive institution for Asians, but for all groups. And so that's what we're doing internally. As a university, we believe we have a responsibility to lead across Canada as well. And as you know, we're having this a dialogue, a national dialogue at Ryerson, and I want to thank Ryerson for their leadership with that. But UBC also held a national dialogue a few months ago, and to bring in groups from different sectors as well as experts to really talk about uh, to understand anti-Asian racism better and to propose a set of steps. And that set of recommendations and the transcript of the entire national dialogue hosted by UBC is now there in the public domain. So that's one way we've been trying to lead. The other is by working together with the Angus Reid Institute to really understand the root causes of anti-Asian racism. And many of those results have been shared publicly. And gratefully, they've been covered by the national press as well.
Hmm. How will you measure the success or effectiveness of all these initiatives, let's say, a year or 2 years or 5 years from now?
Well, I'm very glad that the first national dialogue is being followed so soon by the second dialogue hosted by Ryerson University. And I fully hope that a year from now we'll have yet another dialogue, that we will use a data-driven approach to ask the same sorts of questions of the attendees of a subsequent national dialogue, that will survey well beyond that group, will survey nationally to see whether we are actually making progress against the goals that we've articulated thus far, both within UBC and across Canada.
So this conference is specifically addressing anti-Asian racism. Earlier, you were talking about the connection to all forms of racism. How do you see this conference perhaps evolving to include other forms of racism?
Well, we do live in a very diverse community on our university campuses, but also across Canada in our metropolitan areas, but also in rural areas. The situations that we are discussing are in many cases accentuated in rural areas. And so I believe this is just the beginning of a process for us to seriously look at the issue of anti-Asian racism, but also to look in subsequent conversations at the intersection between different forms of racism. So it's one thing to struggle with anti-Asian racism. It's another thing to struggle with anti-Asian racism if you are a woman or if you are LGBTQ. And so those are real situations. And like I said, if you look at the experiences of an Asian within the metropolitan area, it's very, very different from an Asian in a rural area. And so we need to look into those specific situations seriously, because these are the lives of people that we know and love who are suffering and are experiencing anti-Asian racism. So the first two dialogues are a great start, but this is work that will not be finished in a year or in 2 years. If you think about the history of racism or anti-Asian racism in Canada, it's been going on for decades, if not hundreds of years. And there's so much work that needs to be done. It's one thing to shine a light on systemic racism. It's another thing to systematically really change the laws and the behaviors that are behind that systemic racism. And it's something that you cannot take your foot off the pedal, because as soon as you do that, the ugly and suffocating nature of racism will come back very, very, very quickly. So this has got to be a sustained effort. One of the most amazing things about these dialogues is the passion and dedication of the community that has come together to make progress, but we cannot let up on that effort.
Hmm. I just want to turn things back to you for a minute. In my conversation with Pam Sugiman, we also talked about the silence. And there has been silence, certainly within the Japanese Canadian community around the internment and World War II, and also silence around other forms of racism. Here you are, you're speaking out, and you want to speak out in a big way to make changes. How difficult was it for you to do that, to start to have a voice about this, or was it always, were you always motivated to do this?
Well, certainly it was difficult. It's not something that's common among Asian Canadians to speak out. And there aren't many Asian Canadians or Asians really globally. It's sort of counter to the culture of how we're brought up. And so I do want to recognize that. So certainly it's difficult. Certainly you stick your neck out there. I wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that the title was "Why So Few Asian University Presidents?" And I got an email and then a phone call from a friend of mine, Gordon Gee, the president at the time of Ohio State University. He said, "That was brave of you because it's something that not many people will actually call out." And to answer your question, what really motivated me to do it is just the students that I see in the classrooms. I don't want them to experience the same thing that I experienced. I don't want them to be the only Asian, whatever, whatever sector it is, anymore. I want them to have the same opportunities available to others. And how did I learn to speak up? Well, I have to say, in respect to your question about other forms of racism, having grown up in Baltimore, Maryland, and led a university in Cincinnati, Ohio, I was inspired by the leadership of African Americans and how hard they have worked over decades. And their fight is not over, but I've been inspired by their activism and the change that they were able to achieve. And I want the same for Asian Canadians.
There was an article that I read, and I just want to quote you a little bit of it. Stephen Hayneman is a professor emeritus of international education policy at Vanderbilt, and he wrote this article about moral leadership of universities and talked about how universities must treat all participants, whether students or faculty, fairly, without prejudice. And he went on, and I just want to just use this quote. He said, "Because universities choose the knowledge most worth knowing, higher education institutions play a deciding factor in the development of future leadership and national social cohesion." And he says, "Great leaders in higher education are spokespersons for a civilized world." Does that resonate at all with you?
I believe that educational institutions, especially our universities, really have to be the starting point for cultural change, for behavioral change. First of all, we have millions of students in our universities across Canada. They're going to be our leaders. If you look at UBC, Justin Trudeau is our graduate. There have been 3 prime ministers who've gone through the halls of UBC. And so if we're going to make Canada a better nation, it has to start within our universities. And it can't be an accident. It has to be intentional. It has to be embedded in our strategic plans. And the university president has to be there at the table. It has to be all in. Has to make it clear that this is one of the reasons why we have universities. It is to form citizens of the future who can make the nation and the world a better place.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation, Santa, and I wish you continued success with your work.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your leadership and participation in the dialogue hosted by Ryerson University.
Thank you. That is Santa Ono. He is President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of British Columbia.